Here with you today again for Smash Mammon, our weekly podcast with the Institute of Christian Socialism, where we just have conversations among people who are Christian socialists, talking about the things that matter most to them in their work, in their call, in the ministry, and in the world. Today we are joined by Joerg Rieger. Joerg is the author of Jesus versus Caesar. He's a member with me on the ICS advisory board, and he's a professor at Vanderbilt. Joerg, thank you so much for being here today with us.
It's great to be here, Jonah. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so I know that you have dedicated your career, your vocation, to some of the core ideas and philosophies that we talk about at the Institute for Christian Socialism. I would love to hear a little bit about how you came to identify as both a Christian and a socialist, and how those things kind of interacted with each other in your life story.
Yeah, that's a great question. It really takes me back, sort of way back into my childhood. I was raised as a Methodist in Germany, which is very unusual because in Germany, either you're a Lutheran or you're Roman Catholic, or maybe you're an atheist, and that's all respectable. But being a Methodist is strange. So we always had to explain what that meant. And then my parents, both in the Methodist Church. My mom really found Methodism. She was a Lutheran. She was raised as a Lutheran, but she found Methodism liberating for women because she had some agency. She could even preach, which she did, and teach and do various things. Everything basically that people would do at the time. And in that context, my parents were also postal workers, and they were members of the Postal Worker Union. So in the summers, we would either go to church camp or we would go to union camp. And the sort of things that we learned there weren't always the same, obviously. But I remember some of these union camps really opening my eyes to what's happening in the lives of working people, what the challenges are, and also what the possibilities are. And then taking some of these questions to church camp. The Methodism in which I was raised actually fairly conservative, so these questions didn't necessarily show up. But what I learned was you wanted to take the Bible seriously, and so I was intrigued by this figure of Jesus, who seemed from early on, as long as I can remember, to be a fairly radical type. And so for me, those things always came together, even though in my context, maybe they weren't quite so close. And then, of course, it was a long learning process to see how it really all made sense and what needed to happen before you really could make a difference. But so that's how it started. And for me, both of these traditions were very life-giving, while realizing, of course, that both Christianity as well as some of the social movements also come with their baggages and their problems.
Did you find them to be in conversation with one another around those problems? Like, are there any solutions for some of the problems within one space that are offered in some of the cultures of another space?
When I think back to that, I think the big thing that a lot of people don't realize about socialism is that it really isn't so much primarily about taking care of everything, or social network, social, nets and all of that, but it's really about agency. It's about people being able to do their thing. That is to say, people working and that work actually being honored and appreciated. That's really crucial, right? People creating something and that creative energy being valued and seen for what it is, to each according to their need, but from each according to their ability. So that's sort of one of the big things that I'm not sure I learned that early on, but I think I learned that sort of in a union context where working people really felt that their work mattered. And not only that, it therefore had to be paid fairly and adequately, but that it should give them a say at work. It should give them something, what we now call economic democracy, in addition to political democracy. So that was the one side. On the union side and on the religious side, growing up as a Methodist, this whole idea of sanctification was important to us, which is not something that's very important in a German religious context because, Luther's doctrine of justification was just so much more prominent. But this idea that sanctification had something to do, again, with agency, with making a difference. And, initially we thought of this difference as making a difference in personal relationships, personal lives, living a decent life, doing good, that sort of stuff. But more and more as I grew older, I realized why should you limit that to individual personal relationships? Why shouldn't that be related to broader relationships also, including the political? Now, that was a huge step getting that into the political, but the bigger step, and this is what I'm still working on today, this is sort of my own academic project, to get this agency into the economic realm. And I think this is something that some of the European socialists, especially the social democrats, didn't always see quite well. But I think this is also missing in the US a lot, where people think of socialism as somehow either sharing or being taken care of, but not so much in terms of agency. And so all the way back to these early roots of thinking about sanctification in Wesleyan terms, it became clear that people's agency is not limited to individual relations or political relations. It really has to play itself out in the economic realm. And that, to me, is what's intriguing. It's also the sort of thing, quite frankly, that I think is still largely missing in both socialist and religious conversations, especially Christian conversations in the United States today. So that's where some of my own interests lie.
Well, and for those of us, or those joining us today who may not be familiar with Wesleyan Sanctification, can you summarize a little bit of what that means and what it means to you in the mix of all of these ideas coming together?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I sometimes presuppose too much, probably, but for Wesley, this notion of sanctification, I think, is interesting because it was really based on God's grace that was available to all. So it wasn't a narrowly restricted thing that was only about very pious people, living a very holy life, but it was really a way of really living as a full human being in the world in such a way that you can make a difference, that you become a co-creator with God, and all of that. It's all based, of course, on the work of God. But the work of God for Wesley really started where people would make a difference. And it always moved from the bottom up. One of Wesley's principles, again, something that's not well known even to Methodists, is that religion must not move from the greatest to the least, or the power would appear to be of men, he says at one point in his journal. I have a little book that's titled Grace Under Pressure, Negotiating the Heart of the Methodist Traditions, where that's the basic argument. God's grace, religion moves from the bottom up, not from the top down, or the power would appear to be of men, says Wesley in his 18th century language, And certainly, that's a reference to what we now would think of as patriarchy. That's a reference to early beginning capitalism that took root in those days. And this is why Wesley, right in the beginning, in his own ministry, is there with working people, the labor movement, opposing slavery, and all of these things. That's not to put Wesley out there as a saint, but it's saying that there's something in these Methodist traditions that really works very well with a socialist ethos, in the sense of agency, in the sense of actually moving together to make a difference. And also, this agency is always a collective one. It happens in community. It's not individual heroic actions where somebody does a lot better than somebody else, but where the community sort of bands together, organizes itself. Organizing here is really important. Movement talk is important. That then gets shaped up in history via various revival movements in the United States, which are not, by the way, only religious things that we usually think of, but have implications for, abandoning, abolishing oppressive relationships, supporting working people, the liberation from slavery, And all of these things. Emancipation of women is part of this also, because in the Wesleyan Sanctification, it's not a thing. This is men versus women. It's everybody together, and women have this agency in the movement from the very beginning as preachers, as leaders, and so on.
Yeah, I love, there's also some seeds in there, right, of revolution from below and kind of these
Yes.
understandings of the way that the power of the Holy Spirit works. There's, as somebody who came to the United Methodist tradition in my late 20s, I came via a lot of different contexts, including some very Pentecostal influenced places. And I was really excited to encounter in the Wesleyan tradition this idea of the Holy Spirit as a power who moves how she will, and that is this kind of power from below, very very egalitarian kind of. The power will come from where it comes from, and it may topple the structures that appear to have the power in the ways of the world. And that was really intriguing to me as somebody who, I grew up in the Lutheran tradition primarily in the United States, and so the idea of grace was very Lutheran, and there are many Lutherans in my life who have framed it very differently for me, which I'm super grateful for. But there is a strain within American Christianity, at least, of a kind of passivity around grace, whereas there are traditions within Christianity of, like you say, this very active participation in co-creation with God and sanctification. And I love that, and the call to political action, to economic action, and to say, that the call to be a good person has maybe a different sphere or a different, a broader context than just the way that we tend to think of neighbor. And so I'm super curious to hear from you, what you think of if somebody is active in their faith and trying to take steps to be made holy, to participate with God, to co-create with God. What are some of the spiritual and religious practices that folks can engage in that can move them towards these bigger projects of God's around economic liberation and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. At one level, if you wanted to define grace, I often just say, it's a relationship. It's not a substance. People talk about the gift, and you think of a gift that's wrapped in a box that's handed to you, but it's much better thought of as sort of a relationship with someone else, within a community. And once you think of it that way, spirituality is always about relationships. In the Methodist tradition, you have this notion of the means of grace, which are sort of various tools that are establishing this relationship. So, reading the Bible, praying, Holy Communion, those are the basic means of grace in Methodism that came out of the Anglican tradition, and it's all about relationships. So praying then, if it's a relationship, is not just talking all the time, but it's also listening. And it's not just listening up to the sky. Maybe not listening to the sky at all. It's listening to God all around us and people all around us. And more than that, to really the ecological world all around us, which is also an agent, by the way. It's not just people's agency. It's also much broader agency. Um, um, Productive labor and socialism, as well as reproductive labor, which in some ways is more fundamental, because you cannot have productive labor without reproductive labor. So all of that comes together. But then for Wesley, he added something which he called works of mercy, as also means of grace. And by that, he thought not of social do-gooderism, you have to do a lot of stuff, but again, of the relationship. So for him, what you do there is actually not focused on you, but focused on the relationship, and therefore really also on what's coming back to you. So in this relationship called works of mercy, the one who does merciful works is also transformed. Challenge, perhaps, radically transformed. It's ancient language. I don't really like the works of mercy conversation here, the terms, but so I've talked about this variously as works of justice. More recently, I've talked about it as works of solidarity. So, in a nutshell, I would say, anything that creates solidarity. And solidarity, I sometimes call deep solidarity because I want to avoid this idea that solidarity is just some pragmatic idea or has to do with sameness and people marching in lockstep and so on. It's solidarity that realizes difference, that realizes, how in relationships we're not all the same. And of course, it's a bottom-up relationship. It's not a top-down thing. It doesn't get controlled from either the theologians or the politicians or someone. It really comes from the people. And whatever functions there, it could be reading the Bible, it could be praying, it could be marching together in the streets, it could be building union power, it could be initiating worker cooperatives. That's something I've been doing lately. Working together with a center here in Nashville that's called the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. That's where spirituality happens. Unfortunately, oftentimes that spirituality doesn't really happen in the church much. So in this book, Jesus versus Caesar, my tongue-in-cheek subtitle is "For People Tired of Serving the Wrong God." Now, that's the big question. Are we serving the wrong God? And unfortunately, I'm afraid that in a lot of churches, in a lot of Christianity, Methodism included, too often we're serving the wrong God instead of the right God. And so all the spirituality in the world doesn't help you if your God somehow looks like a white chauvinist, or a capitalist patriarch or something like that, which is not the God of Jesus, is not the God of Israel either. And so reclaiming that is also part of spirituality.
Yeah, and a shout out again to Luther. One of the contributions there, I think, was naming that one of the first liberating experiences we need to have is to liberate ourselves from the expectations of the earthly institutions of religion in order to find and hold that relationship with God and with the people. And so I think that there's so much wisdom in all of these different traditions, urging us and inviting us to come into the streets and out of these institutions of worship of human domination and power, and into that relationship of solidarity that you describe, which I think really truly is holy. And so I really thank you for sharing that. I love that subtitle, and I hope that folks find some liberating invitation to serve the God of the people, and the God of all creation, the God of Israel, the God of Jesus, in a world that is really oriented against that and designed to distract us and to distract our allegiances towards structures of human dominance at every turn. Any final thoughts you have, just from your own practice, your own faith, your own identity, things that you into that work of spiritual solidarity and faith that brings you into liberating spaces?
There's so much more that would need to be said. We've talked a lot about religion here, but maybe two more comments. One about socialism, and the other one about sin, which is usually a downer, right? But it doesn't have to be. The thing about socialism, in my own case, I talked about, growing up in a context where these two things, Christianity and labor were related. But ultimately, I always came from it from this Christian perspective. And I think I only appreciated the labor and the socialist perspective later more and more as I went on. But what I also realized is that these perspectives can help revitalize Christianity. That may be the surprise that people think, we need to put this together, and how can we Christians help? Christians need a lot of help here. I think this is the problem. We've oftentimes misused religion. We've misused images of God. That's why that Jesus versus Caesar book too. This is the work of what we're doing at the Wendling Cook program in Religion and Justice that I direct at Vanderbilt. People can check it out. Religion and Justice, one word, religionandjustice.org is our website. So there's this religious work that has to be done in the midst of these struggles because we need to reclaim religion. which brings me to this last notion of sin, which I think is really important, which may come as a surprise because this is usually used more likely by conservatives, both in politics and in religion, than by progressives. But if you want to talk about agency, you also have to talk about what prevents it. And this is what sin really is. It's not just personal agency here, but it's really structures that prevent us from being active together in community and from being in solidarity. So sin here is the various structures that come together to keep us down. You can talk about this in terms of sexism, racism, and certainly class exploitation. These things have to be taken seriously. And here the socialist traditions are really helpful because they found ways of addressing sin, not ignoring it, not utopian ideas that don't regard what sin is, but socialism helps us to work through this. And there are traditions in Christianity that do that as well. Even John Wesley, a long time ago, realized that poverty was not individual people's fault. He wrote about how people were poor because they were pushed off the land by the big landowners into the factories where they were abused and exploited again by the factory owners. Wesley knew that. Now, there was a lot that we still have to learn since Wesley figured that out, but I think we can really put these things together in such a way that we can together find ways of not only facing sin, but overcoming it in such a way that life will be better for everyone, for people as well as for the planet. This is how ecology and economics and politics and religion all go together in such a way that, to me, there's hope. History has shown that people have done this before. We can do it again, even though we're, of course, up against all kinds of odds today. But in the end, that's where I want to leave it. I'm hopeful, and I'm glad that we're all in this together.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Joerg, and thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you all for joining us today on our various platforms. Know that you can always catch recordings of this after the fact as we release our podcast. But Smash Mammon is a weekly show hosted by the Institute of Christian Socialism, a nonprofit organization committed to building a movement of the ecumenical Christian left. You can learn more about the Institute at christiansocialism.com, and we are entirely donor supported. So if you want to support our work, please go to christiansocialism.com/. I'm your host, Jonah P. Overton. Hope you're with us again next week. And till then, keep smashing away.